This is my testimony. This is my confession. This is my record of what I believe to be true, and what I have come to understand as something else entirely. I speak these words knowing they will never reach the ears they are intended for, or perhaps knowing that they will reach exactly the ears that have always been listening. I no longer know which prospect disturbs me more. My name is Shaslavailos of the Daluth September, 4th Cadre, 2nd Fire Warrior Team. I have served the greater good for 12 Tausir. I have fought on 17 worlds. I have fired my pulse rifle in the name of unity, progress, and the inevitable expansion of our philosophy across the stars. I have killed 243 enemies of the Tau VA. I remember each number, each discharge of my weapon. Each time I believed, truly believed, that I was participating in something pure. That belief sustained me through the blood, through the screams of the Gula as they died confused and afraid, through the awful silence that follows orbital bombardment, through the nights when I would stand watch and wonder why the other species fought so desperately against something so obviously beneficial to them. I was trained well. From the earliest cycles of my life, I was shaped. This is not a criticism. Every society shapes its young. But I want you to understand, whoever you are, listening to this forbidden record, that I did not begin with doubt. I began with certainty. The kind of certainty that makes you sleep soundly after watching a city burn. The kind of certainty that lets you look a Gula child in the eyes and explain, patiently, that their parents died for a better future, for their own good. The Firecast Academies taught us that we were protectors, that our pulse rifles were instruments of mercy, quick, clean deaths for those too stubborn to accept peace. We learned the biology of other species, so we would know where to aim for efficiency. We learned their languages, so we could offer surrender terms. We learned their histories, so we could understand what made them resist the obvious truth, that the Tau VA, the greater good, was the only path forward for a galaxy drowning in its own blood. And I believed it, not because I was forced to, not because I was afraid. I believed it because it was logical. Because when you stand in formation with 36 other fire warriors, each of you a perfect instrument of unified purpose, and you watch the drones hovering in perfect synchronization above you, and you hear the words of the ethereals resonating through your very bones, not through technology, but through something deeper, something that feels like recognition. You understand that you are part of something vast and correct. The first time I heard an ethereal speak, I was 6 Tausir old. His name was Aunshur, though not the famous one, a lesser ethereal assigned to our training cohort. He stood before us, his presence somehow larger than his physical form, and he spoke of the galaxy's suffering. He spoke of the orc hordes that knew only violence, of the Gula Imperium that ground its own people into paste to fuel its wars, of the Eldari who watched civilizations crumble with aristocratic detachment, of the tyrannid swarms that consumed everything without thought or mercy. And then he spoke of us, of the Tau, of how we alone had found the path, how we alone valued every life, every contribution, every voice in service to the collective, how we alone offered the galaxy a choice: join us and prosper, or be left behind in the darkness of your own making. I wept that day. We all did, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of it, from the certainty that we had been born into the one society in all the galaxy that had solved the fundamental equation of existence, that the many must come before the one, and that this is not sacrifice, but a liberation. They assigned me to the fire caste at 8 Tausir. My aptitude tests showed I had the reflexes, the discipline, the capacity for necessary detachment. I was proud, the fire caste with a shield and the sword. We were the ones who would carry the greater good to the stars, not through persuasion alone, but through the undeniable argument of superior firepower applied with precision and restraint. Training was rigorous, beautiful in its way. We learned to move as one organism, to communicate through gesture and thought cant so efficiently that spoken words became redundant. We bonded with our team, my brothers Shasala Kaismir and Shasala Tauros, my sister Shasala Saselin. We ate together, trained together, learned together. We became a single weapon with 4 bodies. Our instructors taught us that hesitation was the enemy, not cruelty. We were never taught cruelty, but hesitation. The moment of doubt that allows the enemy to respond, that prolongs suffering, that introduces chaos into what should be a clean implementation of necessary force. They taught us to trust our training, our equipment, and our purpose. They taught us that guilt was a luxury the galaxy could not afford, and that the greater good asked us to bear the weight of difficult actions so that others would not have to. I graduated with honors. I received my pulse rifle, that elegant weapon, so much more sophisticated than the crude projectile throwers of the Gulag, and my bonding knife, and my armor. I swore my oath before an ethereal whose name I was not permitted to know, and I felt his approval wash over me like warm water, like coming home, like being recognized by the universe itself. My first deployment was to the world-designated WH40K Tertius 9, a mining colony that had refused the water caste's generous terms. They claimed they wanted to remain part of their Imperium, despite clear evidence that the Imperium had forgotten they existed, that their tithes went unpaid and unanswered, that they were slowly dying of preventable diseases and malnutrition while worshiping a corpse god who could not hear their prayers. We offered them medicine, infrastructure, education, a place in something greater than their small, dying world. They responded with lost gunfire. I still remember my first kill. A Gulag soldier male, approximately 30 Terran years, malnourished, wearing armor that had been repaired so many times it was more prayer than protection. He was aiming at Sauceolin. I fired without thought. My pulse carbine round hit him in the center of mass. He disintegrated from the thermal bloom. Efficient, clean, necessary. I felt nothing. This was what I had trained for. This was my purpose. He had made his choice, and I had made mine, and the greater good advanced another meter forward. We pacified the colony in 4 days. Casualties were minimal on both sides. We used pulse rounds calibrated for suppression rather than lethality when possible, and gas grenades that induced unconsciousness rather than death. When it was over, the colonists who survived were given food, shelter, and education about why their resistance had been illogical. Most of them adapted within a generation. Their children, born under Tau administration, would never know they had been conquered. They would only know peace, prosperity, and purpose. This was the greater good in action. This was what I had been made for. I tell you all of this history, this context, this certainty, because you need to understand what I was before I became what I am now. You need to understand that my transformation was not a breaking, but a recognition, or perhaps it was both. I no longer trust my own judgment about such things. The doubt began so quietly I did not notice it at first. It started with a name I was not supposed to hear. We were on our 6th campaign, the pacification of a world called Brachis in the Damocles Gulf region, a Gulag mining world, like so many others, stubborn, isolated, clinging to their Imperium despite all evidence that it had abandoned them. The campaign was proceeding according to standard protocols. The water caste had made their offers. The offers had been refused with violence. The fire caste had responded with measured force. I was performing routine reconnaissance with Kaismir when we intercepted a Gulag transmission. This was not unusual. We often monitored their communications to predict their tactical movements. But this transmission was different. It was not military chatter. It was a civilian broadcast, and the speaker was weeping as she spoke. "They're here again," she said in Gothic, the barbaric tongue of the Imperium, the blue ones with their false peace. My grandmother told me stories about them, about what happened on Cronus, about the ones who accepted their offer. They say they weren't conquered. They say they chose. But my grandmother remembered. She remembered their eyes. She said they looked happy, but their eyes were empty, like something had been taken out. Kaismir made a dismissive gesture. "Propaganda," he said through our comlink. "The Imperium teaches them to fear what they do not understand. It is expected." I found myself thinking about those words. Empty eyes. What did that mean? I had seen the populations we had integrated. They did not seem empty. They seemed content. They worked. They learned. They contributed. Many of them expressed genuine gratitude for being saved from the Imperium's grinding oppression. I filed the thought away. A single civilian's fear, I told myself, meant nothing against the evidence of hundreds of successfully integrated worlds. The second discrepancy came 3 months later, on a different world entirely. We had just secured a settlement, no casualties on our side, minimal casualties on theirs. The water caste representatives arrived to begin the integration process, and I was assigned to provide security while they worked. This meant standing watch while they conducted their sessions with the local population. I watched through the window of the processing center as an ethereal, Al-Shars, spoke to a group of perhaps 50 Gula civilians. They had been resistant when they arrived, angry. Some had been weeping. Some had tried to flee. But the ethereal spoke to them, and I watched their faces change. It was beautiful in a way. The transformation, the fear melting away, the anger dissolving, the confusion replaced by understanding. Within an hour, they were nodding. Within 2 hours, they were asking questions about how they could contribute to the greater good. Within 3 hours, some were weeping again, but now from gratitude, from relief at having been saved from their own ignorance. This was what the ethereals did. This was their gift. They could speak truth so perfectly that even the most indoctrinated mind could not help but recognize it. This was why they led us. This was why their words resonated in our bones. But I found myself watching one Gula in particular, a male, elderly by their standards, with scars across his face that suggested a life of violence. He had been the most resistant when he arrived, shouting about the Emperor, about loyalty, about dying before serving Xenos. But as the ethereal spoke, I watched his expression change, and I noticed something. It changed too quickly. One moment he was defiant. The next moment, not gradually, but in a visible instant, his face went slack, his eyes unfocused. And then he smiled, and the smile was serene. And when the ethereal asked if he understood now, he said yes in a voice that sounded like peace itself. But I had seen that transitional moment, that instant when something shifted, and I found myself wondering, was that understanding, or was that something else? I pushed the thought down. I told myself I was being paranoid. The Gula brain was different from ours. Perhaps their cognitive processes simply worked differently. Perhaps what looked like an abrupt change was actually a cascade of realizations happening too quickly for an outside observer to track. I told myself this. I almost believed it. The third discrepancy was harder to dismiss. We were stationed on a world called Vigos Prime, serving as honor guard during a ceremonial address by the ethereal supreme of our expedition fleet. Thousands of fire warriors stood in perfect formation. Thousands of other cast members filled the plaza. Human auxiliaries, integrated populations who had chosen to serve the greater good, stood in their designated sections, their faces turned upward toward the ethereal with expressions of devotion. The ethereal supreme spoke of unity, of progress, of the galaxy's future under the guidance of the Tau Va. His words were, as always, perfect. Each syllable seemed to carry weight beyond meaning, and I felt it. That familiar sensation of rightness, of recognition, of being part of something vast and true. But then something happened. A technical failure, perhaps. The amplification system stuttered for perhaps 3 seconds. The ethereal's voice cut out completely. And in those 3 seconds, I felt something change. Not in me, or perhaps in me, but subtly. It was like a rope I hadn't known I was holding had suddenly gone slack. I felt lighter, colder, more separate. I looked around at the other fire warriors. Their expressions had changed too. Subtle shifts, confusion, a kind of distance. One of them, Shasuito Vash, a team leader I knew to be completely devoted, had her hand halfway to her pulse rifle before the sound returned and the ethereal's voice filled the plaza again. And then everything snapped back. The warmth returned, the certainty. Kovash lowered her hand and her expression returned to one of attentive devotion. The plaza full of warriors and civilians and auxiliaries all swayed slightly, as if pulled by the same invisible current, back into that state of unified purpose. No one mentioned it afterward. I tried to bring it up to Kaismir later that evening, carefully, obliquely. "Did you notice anything unusual during the ceremony?" I asked. He looked at me with genuine confusion. "Unusual? No. It was a perfect ceremony. The ethereal supreme's words were truth itself." "Why do you ask?" I told him I had thought I saw something in the crowd, a possible security concern. He accepted this and moved on. But I could not move on, because I knew what I had felt, and I knew what I had seen, and I knew that I was now doing something I had been trained never to do. I was questioning. The questioning grew from there, slowly, like rust spreading across metal. Small observations that accumulated into a weight I could not ignore. I noticed that fire warriors who spent more time in proximity to ethereals seemed more unified, more certain, but also less individual. Their speech patterns began to converge. Their thought processes became more predictable. They would finish each other's sentences not through familiarity, but through an eerie synchronization that went beyond mere teamwork. I noticed that integrated human populations always, without exception, expressed gratitude for their integration. Always. Even those who had fought most bitterly, who had killed Tau, who had watched their friends die. Within months of living under ethereal guidance, they spoke of the greater good with genuine fervor. 100% conversion rate. 100% compliance. I noticed that certain questions were never asked. Not forbidden. Tau do not forbid questions, but simply never asked. Questions about the nature of the ethereals themselves, about where they came from, about why their presence felt the way it did, about why their words resonated in ways that other words did not. And I noticed that when I found myself beginning to think such questions, there was a kind of pressure against them, not external, internal, a feeling that these thoughts were not productive, that they served no purpose, that they were a distraction from my duties, that I should let them go and return to my purpose. But I did not let them go. I held them. I examined them in the quiet hours of the night, when I stood watch alone and had only my own mind for company. I began to keep a private log, not an official record. Those were monitored, reviewed, part of our continuous performance evaluation. A personal journal, stored in encrypted files on my battlesuit's auxiliary systems. I wrote down my observations, my questions, my doubts. I wrote, why do the ethereal's words feel different from other words? I wrote, why does their presence feel necessary? Why does their absence feel wrong? I wrote, what happened in those 3 seconds when the sound cut out? I wrote, are we being guided or controlled? Is there a difference? And with each entry, I felt myself becoming more separate, more isolated, more aware of something I could not quite name, a truth that existed just beyond the edge of my understanding, waiting to be recognized. It was around this time that I met the human called Marcus. Marcus was a Gula auxiliary, integrated into the Tau Empire approximately 15 Tau Seer before I met him. He served as a cultural liaison, helping newly integrated human populations adapt to life within the greater good. By all accounts, he was exemplary, dedicated, articulate about the benefits of the Tau VA, grateful for his salvation from the Imperium's darkness. I met him during a routine security assignment on the world of Sael-Kel, where a large human population was being processed for integration. He approached me during my watch, which was unusual. Auxiliaries typically maintained respectful distance from fire warriors unless directly addressed. Shasla, he said in fluent Tau Sia, our language. May I speak with you briefly? I have concerns about the integration process that I believe you should be aware of. I was immediately alert. Concerns were acceptable. Identifying problems was part of serving the greater good. But something in his tone suggested this was not a routine operational concern. Speak, I said. He glanced around, which should have been my first warning. Not here. The observation drones are everywhere, and I need to show you something. Something I think you need to see. This was highly irregular, but I was already infected with my own doubts, already looking for answers to questions I barely understood. Against my training, against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him later in a maintenance section where drone coverage was minimal. He arrived precisely on time, carrying a small datapad. His hands were shaking slightly. "I'm taking an enormous risk," he said. "If they discover I've accessed these files, if they know I'm showing them to you. But I think you're ready to see them. I've been watching you, Shasla. I've seen the way you observe the ethereals, the way you flinch, just slightly, when they speak. You're waking up, just like I did." "Waking up from what?" I asked, my hand resting near my pulse pistol. "From the dream," he said. "From the beautiful dream they weave around us. Here, these are my personal records. From before." He activated the datapad. The first file was a video log, dated approximately 16 Tausir prior. It showed Marcus, younger, harder, dressed in Imperial Guard flak armor. His face was different. His eyes were different. They were angry, fierce, fully present. "My name is Sergeant Marcus Kellyan of the 47th Brachian Infantry," the recorded Marcus said. "We've been fighting the Xenos for 3 months. They keep talking about surrender, about joining them, about some kind of greater good. But we know what that means. We've heard the stories from the survivors of other worlds. They take your mind. They make you into something else. They smile and tell you it's freedom, but it's slavery. It's..." The video cut off abruptly. The next file was another video, dated 3 months later. The same Marcus, but changed. Cleaner, calmer, sitting in what looked like a Tau integration facility. "My name is Marcus Kellyan," he said, and his voice was different, softer, more measured. "I was confused before. I was a victim of Imperial propaganda, but I understand now. The Tau offered us peace, and we responded with violence born from ignorance. The ethereals have shown me the truth. The greater good is not slavery. It is liberation from the tyranny of individual selfishness. I am grateful. I am at peace. I wish to serve." I looked at the real Marcus, standing before me in the dim maintenance corridor. "These files should not exist," I said. "All personal records are cataloged. This is hidden," he said. "I've kept them hidden for years, because I needed to remember. I needed proof that I was someone else once, that I used to think differently, that what I feel now is not what I felt then." "You underwent integration," I said. "You learned. You grew beyond your Imperial indoctrination. This is documented. This is understood." "Is it?" He leaned forward, and there was something desperate in his eyes. "Shasla, I have memories of both. I remember being that sergeant. I remember my certainty that the Tau were evil, that they were manipulators, that they were stealing something fundamental from the people they integrated. I remember that passion, that conviction, that absolute certainty. And I also remember vividly, clearly, the moment in the integration chamber when Ethereal Aunel Tauen spoke to me. I remember his words washing over me. I remember feeling my resistance crumble. I remember thinking, yes, this is truth. How could I have been so blind?" He paused, and his hands clenched on the datapad. "But here's what troubles me, Shasla. Both of those certainties feel exactly the same. The certainty I had as an Imperial soldier that the Tau were evil feels identical in texture, in conviction, in absolute sureness, to the certainty I have now that the greater good is correct. Do you understand what I'm saying? The certainty didn't change. Only the content changed. The mechanism that makes me believe is the same. Only what I believe is different." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "You were saying the ethereals manipulated you?" "I'm saying I don't know," he said, and there was anguish in his voice. "That's the horror of it. I cannot tell the difference between genuine understanding and imposed understanding. When I'm near an ethereal, everything feels right. Their words feel true in a way that transcends argument or evidence. But when I'm alone, when I'm far from their presence, I can feel cracks, seams, places where the certainty doesn't quite fit together. And I wonder, am I experiencing doubt because I'm still contaminated by Imperial propaganda? Or am I experiencing clarity because I'm finally away from the influence?" He activated another file on the datapad. This one was a text document, densely written. "I've been researching," he said, "using my access as a cultural liaison. The Tau don't restrict information. That's one of the beautiful ironies. They genuinely believe in transparency. So the information is there. if you know how to look for it, and if you're willing to see it. The document was titled, Physiological and Neurological Analysis of Ethereal Caste Interaction Patterns. I began to read. The text was technical, clinical, assembled from dozens of sources, medical reports, xenobiological studies, integration assessment documents. But the pattern it revealed was undeniable. Ethereals produced pheromones. This was documented, known, not secret. All Tau castes responded to these pheromones with increased compliance, focus, and sense of purpose. This was understood as a natural evolution. The Ethereals had developed the ability to unify the Tau species, to overcome the fractiousness that had nearly destroyed Tau civilization in its early history. But the document went deeper. It compiled studies showing that the pheromones didn't just encourage compliance. They actively suppressed certain neural pathways. They reduced activity in the brain regions associated with individual desire, personal ambition, self-preservation instinct. They enhanced activity in regions associated with group identity, purpose recognition, and hierarchical acceptance. In short, the Ethereal's presence physically altered the brain chemistry of those around them. This was still explainable, still acceptable even. It could be argued that this was simply biological leadership, that the Ethereals had evolved to lead, and the other castes had evolved to be led, and that this was no different from the chemical bonding between any social species. But then I reached the section on humans. Humans were not evolved to respond to ethereal pheromones. Their neural architecture was completely different. Yet, after sufficient exposure to ethereal presence, they exhibited the same compliance patterns, the same neural pathway alterations, the same absolute certainty in the righteousness of the Tau VA. The document included testimony from a water caste biologist who had studied this phenomenon. The human neurological response to ethereal pheromones should not be possible. Their brain structure lacks the receptors our species possesses. Yet, after approximately 40 to 60 hours of cumulative exposure to ethereal presence, human subjects demonstrate behavioral and neurological changes consistent with deep integration. This suggests the ethereal influence operates on a level we do not yet fully understand, possibly quantum field manipulation, possibly directed psychic resonance, possibly mechanisms beyond current scientific categorization. Recommendation: further study required. Further study required. Such clinical language for what it was describing. I looked up at Marcus. This document, where did you find this? It was part of an internal review, circulated among the Earth caste researchers on WH September. It was never classified, because classification would imply there was something to hide, and the Tau don't hide things. It's simply not widely distributed, not discussed, not thought about, because thinking about it serves no productive purpose. He leaned back against the wall, and I saw how tired he looked. How old? I've spent years trying to understand what I am now, he said. Am I Marcus Kelly, an Imperial soldier, who was broken and remade into a servant of the Tau? Or am I Marcus Kelly, an enlightened human, who was freed from Imperial lies and chose to serve a better future? Both feel true. Both feel like me. But they can't both be right. Perhaps they can, I heard myself say. Perhaps you were broken, and in breaking, you were freed. Perhaps the Imperium had already shaped you, already imposed their certainty on you, and the Ethereal simply replaced one programming with another, better programming. He smiled sadly. Yes, that's what I tell myself most days. That's what feels true when I'm doing my work, helping others integrate, watching their faces change from fear to understanding. But then I have nights like tonight, where I look at these old videos, and I see someone who was absolutely certain he was right, and I am now absolutely certain he was wrong. And I wonder, what makes me so sure my current certainty is more valid than my previous certainty? I had no answer for him. He gathered his datapad. I'm showing you this because I think you're beginning to ask the same questions. I can see it in how you watch the Ethereals now, and how you stand just a little farther away than you used to, and how you hesitate just for a fraction of a second before responding to their presence. You're waking up, or going insane. I genuinely cannot tell which. After he left, I stood in that maintenance corridor for a long time, thinking about certainty, about how it feels to believe something absolutely, about whether there is any difference between belief and programming. And I thought about my own memories of the ethereals, of that first time I heard one speak, and wept from the rightness of it, of how their presence made everything clear, made every doubt dissolve, made purpose feel like the most natural thing in the universe. Was that enlightenment, or was that chemistry? And if it was chemistry, did that make it less real? I did not know. I still do not know. But I knew I could no longer simply accept. I had to understand. That was when I began my true investigation, not into the enemy, not into the galaxy's countless threats, but into the very foundation of everything I had been taught to believe. The Tau do not hide their history. This is one of the principles I had always admired about our society. Transparency, documentation, the preservation of knowledge for the collective benefit. Our archives are vast, detailed, accessible to any cast member with legitimate research purposes. I claimed I was preparing a tactical analysis of fire cast adaptation strategies across different campaigns. This was accepted without question. I was granted access to historical military records, integration reports, sociological studies spanning the entire history of the Tau Empire's expansion. But I was not looking at military tactics. I was looking at the ethereals. I began with the official histories. The story every Tau child learns in their foundational education. How our species nearly destroyed itself in the Mon Tau, the Terror, a period of warfare and fratricide when the different Tau septs fought each other with escalating brutality. How, at the moment of our potential extinction, the ethereals appeared, not from any known September, not from any documented lineage. They simply arrived, and where they went, peace followed. Conflicts ceased. The septs united. The greater good was formalized. The Tau species was saved. A beautiful story, an inspiring story, the kind of story that makes you grateful to exist in the shadow of such wisdom. But as I read deeper, I noticed something peculiar. The records from before the ethereal's arrival were fragmentary, contradictory, incomplete. This was explained as a consequence of the Mon Tau. Records destroyed in the fighting, archives burned, oral histories lost. Understandable. Tragic, but understandable. Yet the records from immediately after the ethereal's arrival were pristine, perfect, comprehensive, as if history had suddenly decided to become coherent the moment the ethereals appeared. I found one fragment from the Mon Tau period that had survived. A personal journal from a fire-cast warrior named Shasui Kesvar, written in archaic Tau SIA. The entry was dated approximately 6 Tau Seer before the ethereal's arrival. We are destroying ourselves. Every sept believes they alone understand the proper path forward. My brothers and I have killed more Tau this cycle than all other enemies combined. We are efficient at self-annihilation. Sometimes I wonder if we deserve to survive. If a species that turns on itself with such perfection should be allowed to continue existing. The entry ended there. No further records from Kesvar existed, but what struck me was the tone. The despair, yes, but also the clarity, the self-awareness, the ability to look at his own species and judge it, criticize it, question its right to exist. I compared this to writings from the period after the ethereal's arrival. Firecast journals, personal logs, cultural documents. The tone was utterly different. Unified, optimistic, purpose-driven, grateful. Every single document expressed some variation of, we were lost, and the ethereals showed us the path. We were broken, and they made us whole. Every single one. I thought about probability, about the statistical likelihood that an entire species, recently saved from extinction, would universally, without exception, express perfect gratitude and acceptance. No resentment at being led by this new caste. No questions about where they came from or why they had such profound authority. No resistance, no doubt, no alternative perspectives. It was as if a switch had been flipped in the collective Tau consciousness. Before, chaos, doubt, self-destructive individualism. After, unity, certainty, collective purpose. I found another document, this one from a watercast historian named WH40K, written approximately 20 Tauseer after the Ethereal's arrival. It was part of an early attempt to chronicle the formation of the Tau Empire. There is a curious gap in our historical understanding regarding the Ethereal's origins. When questioned, the Ethereals themselves offer only that they emerged from the mountains of the Tau September during the final years of the Montau, drawn by the suffering of our species and compelled to intervene. This explanation is accepted without controversy, as the Ethereal's wisdom is self-evident in their actions. However, as a historian, I find myself curious, not doubtful, never doubtful, but curious about the mechanisms by which such a perfectly adapted leadership caste could emerge at precisely the moment of our greatest need. It suggests either extraordinary fortune or the entry ended mid-sentence. I searched for other writings by WH40K. There were none after this date. His name appeared in casualty lists from a minor skirmish with orc raiders 3 months later. Killed in action. His historical work was never completed. Curious, I began to notice a pattern. Scholars who asked questions about the Ethereal's origins often had their work end abruptly, not through obvious suppression. There were no records of censorship, no evidence of persecution. They simply stopped, moved to other projects, died in accidents, retired early. Their curiosity evaporated as if it had never existed. I found a watercast linguist named WH40K who had been studying the Ethereal's dialect of Tau-Sia. She had noticed that they used certain grammatical structures that did not appear in any other Tau Sept's language patterns. She had written, "The Ethereal speech incorporates elements that suggest either very ancient linguistic roots, predating the divergence of the Septs, or possibly external influence from." Her research notes ended there. Her subsequent work focused entirely on Gula language acquisition and never mentioned the Ethereals again. I thought about my own moment of curiosity, standing in that maintenance corridor with Marcus. I thought about the pressure I had felt against certain thoughts. Not external pressure, internal. A feeling that these questions were not productive. Was that my own judgment, or was that something else? I went deeper into the archives. I requested access to xenobiological studies, specifically those related to ethereal physiology. This was more difficult to justify, but I claimed I was investigating potential enemy vulnerabilities to ethereal influence. Could we potentially replicate their unifying effect as a weapon against divided enemies? The request was granted, though I noticed it took longer than usual, and I received a routine inquiry from my cadre overseer about the nature of my research. I told him I was being thorough. He accepted this, but I noticed he watched me more closely after that. The xenobiological files were fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. The Ethereals were biologically Tau, but with significant differences. Their pheromone glands were vastly more developed. The neural architecture showed unusual complexity in regions associated with social processing and empathic resonance. They aged more slowly than other castes. They were universally calm, measured, seemingly incapable of the kind of fear or anger that drove other beings. One report from an Earth caste researcher named Fio El Shirar noted, "The Ethereals appear to be not a natural evolution of the Tau genome, but rather a directed modification. The genetic markers suggest intentional engineering, though by whom or what remains unclear. The sophistication of the modifications far exceeds any biotechnology available during the Montau period. Recommendation: further investigation into potential external intervention during the Ethereal's emergence." I read that paragraph 3 times. External intervention, directed modification, engineering. The implications were staggering. The Ethereals had not evolved naturally. They had been created by someone, by something. During the darkest period of Tau history, when the species was on the brink of extinction, someone or something had introduced a biological mechanism for control. No, not control, for unity, for guidance, for salvation. But who and why? I found one more document buried deep in the archives, classified as historical speculation, non-canonical. It was written by a poor UI researcher whose name had been redacted. The document was titled, the intervention hypothesis. The text was cautious, heavily caveat, almost apologetic in tone, but its core argument was clear. If we accept that the ethereals were engineered rather than naturally evolved, we must ask, who possessed the biotechnology to create them? During the Montau, the Tau species had barely achieved space flight. We had no genetic engineering capabilities of this sophistication. Therefore, the engineering must have been performed by an external party. Candidates, the Eldari possessed sufficient biotechnology, but their civilization was in collapse during this period due to the fall. The Imperium of Man was too distant and too hostile. The orcs lacked the sophistication. The Tyranids had not yet arrived. The Necrons were still dormant. This leaves few possibilities. Either an unknown xeno species intervened in Tau evolution for unknown reasons, or the intervention came from within the Tau genome itself, activated by specific environmental pressures. A kind of genetic failsafe, planted in our species' distant past by even more ancient progenitors. But this raises a disturbing question. If the ethereals were created or activated to save the Tau species from self-destruction, what is their ultimate purpose? Are they permanent features of our civilization, or temporary guides meant to shepherd us to some developmental threshold? And if temporary, what happens when their purpose is fulfilled? Do they deactivate? Do we lose their guidance? Do we return to the chaos of the Montau? Or, and this is the possibility that troubles me most, are we meant to never outgrow our need for them? Are we a species permanently dependent on external control, unable to function without their unifying presence? Are we, in essence, an incomplete species, requiring the ethereals to be whole? I do not know. I cannot know. But I feel compelled to document these questions, even though I suspect they will never be answered, even though I suspect that asking them serves no productive purpose, even though I feel, even as I write this, a pressure to stop, to delete this document, to return to more useful work. I will file this in the archives nonetheless. Perhaps someday, someone will need to know that these questions were asked, that someone wondered, that doubt existed, even if only for a moment, even if only in the mind of one insignificant researcher who should probably return to more important matters. The document ended there. I searched for any other work by this redacted researcher. Nothing, as if they had never existed beyond this single, troubled speculation. I sat in the archive chamber for a long time after reading that, staring at the screen, thinking about incomplete species, about permanent dependency, about the possibility that everything we believed about ourselves, about our unity, our purpose, our greater good, was not a choice but a biological imperative imposed from outside. And I thought, if that is true, does it matter? If the ethereals make us better than we would be without them, if they enable us to achieve things we could never achieve alone, if they save us from our own self-destructive nature, does it matter that we have no choice in accepting them? Is a beneficial prison still a prison? Is enforced peace still peace? Is programmed purpose still purpose? I did not know. The questions spiraled in my mind, each one leading to another, each one undermining the certainty I had built my entire life upon. I left the archives that day feeling like I was standing on the edge of something vast and dark, like I had been living my entire life on a thin shell of ice, and I had just discovered the infinite cold water beneath it. But I was not done. I had one more source to consult, one more testimony to hear, and this one would come from someone who had been there, who had seen the ethereals arrive, who remembered the Montau and the transformation that followed. I would speak to one of the oldest ones, the Tau who had lived through the transition, who could tell me what it felt like to go from chaos to order, to go from doubt to certainty, if any still existed. Finding one of the oldest ones was not easy. The Tau do not revere age the way some species do. We value contribution, not longevity, but I knew they existed. Tau who had been alive during the Montau, who had seen the ethereals arrive, who remembered what came before. They were rare. Most had died during the wars, or in the centuries since. The few who remained were kept comfortable, honored for their historical significance, but largely isolated. Not deliberately. The Tau do not imprison their elders, but practically. What use is ancient memory in a society focused on progress? I found reference to one in a medical facility on WH September. His name was Shasel, though his rank was honorary now. He had not served actively in over a century. The records listed him as 147 Tausir old, born during the final years of the Montau, a living witness to the transformation of our species. I requested an interview under the guise of collecting oral histories for Firecast tactical documentation. The request was approved, though again I noticed a slight delay, a subtle suggestion that perhaps my research interests were becoming too broad, too scattered. I ignored the suggestion. I was too close now, too deep in my investigation to stop because of administrative concern. The medical facility was quiet, peaceful. The elderly Tau there were cared for with typical efficiency. Clean rooms, proper nutrition, mental stimulation activities. They were not neglected, but they were separate, set aside from the productive flow of society, like books on a shelf that no one reads anymore, but that might contain useful information someday. Shasel sat in a sunlit room, staring out at the gardens beyond. His skin was pale, mottled with age. His body was thin, fragile in the way of old Tau, but his eyes were clear, sharp. When I entered, he turned his head slowly and studied me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You're not here for oral histories," he said. His voice was raspy but firm. "You're here because you have questions. Real questions. The kind of questions that itch in the back of your mind like a parasite you cannot remove." I sat down across from him carefully. "Shasel, I am researching." "Do not lie to an old warrior who has nothing left to lose," he interrupted. "I can see it in your eyes. The confusion, the doubt, the terrible, creeping awareness that something is not quite right. I see it because I felt it once, long ago, before I learned to stop feeling it." He gestured to a chair. "Sit. Ask your questions. I will tell you what I remember. Though I warn you, memory is not reliable, especially memories from before. Sometimes I am not sure if what I remember is what actually happened, or what I have been taught to remember." I sat. "You were alive during the Montau. I was a young warrior, perhaps 20 Tausir old when the Ethereals arrived, old enough to remember the chaos, old enough to understand what changed." "Tell me about the chaos." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. It was liberating in a terrible way. We fought because we believed in things, different things. The Tau September believed in aggressive expansion. The Dalyuth September believed in cautious consolidation. The Sasea September believed in military excellence above all. And we killed each other over these beliefs because we cared about them absolutely. He looked at me directly. We were not mindless. We were not irrational. We had reasons, philosophies, competing visions of what the Tau species should become. And yes, we were destroying ourselves, but we were destroying ourselves while believing we were fighting for something true. And then the Ethereals arrived. And then they arrived. His voice changed, softened. From the mountains of the Tau September, they simply appeared, walking down from the heights, unarmed, unafraid. And wherever they went, the fighting stopped. Not because they commanded it to stop, not because they threatened or cajoled, but because when you stood in their presence, the fighting suddenly seemed unnecessary, pointless, a waste of resources that could be better spent on cooperation. How did it feel? He closed his eyes, like waking up from a nightmare, like suddenly seeing clearly after a lifetime of blindness, like having a question answered that you didn't know you had been asking. It felt like relief, like coming home, like being recognized by the universe itself. I felt a chill. Those were almost exactly the words I had used to describe my own first experience with an ethereal. "But," he continued, and his eyes opened, and there was something haunted in them. It also felt like losing something, like a color draining out of the world, like a frequency of sound that you could suddenly no longer hear. We stopped fighting, yes. We unified, yes. We became efficient, purposeful, directed. But we also became less varied, less contradictory. less individual. You remember feeling this? I remember remembering it, he said carefully. Does that make sense? I have memories of standing in the presence of the first ethereal I ever encountered, Unbearable, one of the original council, and feeling that dual sensation, relief and loss, clarity and absence. But I cannot tell you if those memories are real, or if they are reconstructions my mind created later, trying to make sense of the transition. He leaned forward, his frail body somehow carrying great intensity. Here's what I can tell you with certainty. Before the ethereals, I had opinions, strong ones. I believed the Dalu philosophy of careful expansion was correct. I argued with my fellow warriors about it. I was passionate, angry, convinced I was right. And after the ethereals, I still had opinions. But they were no longer mine. They were ours. The distinction between what I thought and what we thought dissolved. And I was grateful for that dissolution, because individual thought had nearly destroyed us. But you're speaking of individual thought now, I said. You're expressing doubt, personal reflection. How is that possible if? Because I am dying, he said simply. My body is failing. I have perhaps another Tausir, perhaps less. And the ethereals do not visit the dying. We are no longer productive, no longer part of the active flow of society. So their influence fades. The pheromones clear from my system slowly. The neural pathways they suppressed begin to reactivate, and I start to remember what it felt like to be separate, to be an individual mind rather than a note in a symphony. He smiled, but it was not a happy expression. Do you know what the cruel joke is? I don't want this. I don't want to be separate again, because being separate hurts. Being individual means carrying the weight of your own thoughts, your own doubts, your own conflicts. The unity was better. The unity was peace. But now that I'm losing it, now that I'm becoming individual again, I can see what it cost. What did it cost? The ability to choose, he said. Not choice itself. We still make choices, constantly, every day. But the ability to choose differently than the collective. To want something that conflicts with the greater good. To prioritize yourself over the many. That ability was removed so subtly, so completely, that we didn't even notice it was gone. Because we didn't want it anymore. Because wanting it felt wrong. Because the ethereal's presence made wanting it feel wrong. He reached out and gripped my hand with surprising strength. You want to know if you're still yourself, don't you? You want to know if your service to the greater good is genuine conviction or programmed compliance. You want to know if you're a person or a tool. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The answer, he said, is that the question itself is meaningless. You are both. We're all both. We are people who have been shaped into tools, or tools who believe they are people. The ethereals did not destroy our personhood. They refined it. They took our chaotic, self-destructive individuality and channeled it into productive collective action. Is that better? By every practical measure, yes. We are more successful, more peaceful, more effective than we ever were during the Montau. But is it authentic? Is it really us? He released my hand and leaned back. I don't know. And the terrible truth is that knowing wouldn't change anything. Because even now, even with this clarity, even with this temporary freedom from their influence, if an ethereal walked through that door right now and spoke to me, I would feel relief. I would welcome the return of certainty. I would choose to stop questioning, because questioning hurts and certainty feels like love. That's not choice, I said, if you're compelled to choose it. Who says you're not compelled to choose everything? He interrupted. The Gula Imperium conditions their soldiers through indoctrination, through brutal training, through religious fervor. Are they choosing to serve the Emperor, or are they programmed? The orcs are genetically designed to love violence. Are they choosing to fight, or are they following genetic imperatives? Every species, every society, every individual is shaped by forces beyond their control. The ethereals are simply more honest about it. They don't pretend we're making free choices. They don't dress up the programming in the language of divine mandate or genetic destiny. They simply are what they are, and we are what we are, and together we function more effectively than we ever could alone. But if we knew, I said, If everyone knew what the ethereals truly are, what they truly do, they would not care, he said flatly. That is what you do not yet understand. Even if you could broadcast the truth to every Tau in the Empire, even if you could show them the neurological studies, the genetic engineering, the pheromonal control, the historical manipulation, they would not rebel. They would not resist. Because the ethereal's influence is not maintained through ignorance. It is maintained through biology, through chemistry, through mechanisms that bypass rational thought entirely. He looked at me with something like pity. You think you have discovered a conspiracy, a hidden truth that, once revealed, would set us free. But there is no conspiracy. The ethereals do not hide what they are. They simply are. And we do not resist what they are, because in their presence, we do not want to resist, cannot want to resist. The machinery of desire itself has been adjusted. Then why are you telling me this? I asked. Why warn me? Why remember? Because, he said quietly, someone should know. Even if knowing changes nothing, even if this conversation is ultimately meaningless, even if you walk out of here and within hours find yourself back in proximity to an ethereal and feel all these doubts dissolve like morning fog, someone should know that we were something else once, that we had the capacity for chaos, for disagreement, for self-destructive individualism, that we gave it up, or had it taken from us, in exchange for unity and purpose. He closed his eyes, suddenly looking very tired. And perhaps in some distant future, if the ethereals ever leave us or fade away, or complete whatever purpose they were designed for, someone will need to remember that we were capable of functioning without them, that we were once whole, in our broken, chaotic way, that we could survive being individuals again if we had to. Do you think that will happen? That the ethereals will leave? He was quiet for so long I thought he had fallen asleep. Then no. I think we will carry them with us forever. I think they are part of us now, as essential as any organ. I think we have become a species that cannot exist without external guidance. And I think that is not necessarily a tragedy, just a truth, a fundamental truth about what we are. I left him there, in his sunlit room, and walked back through the facility's quiet corridors, and I found myself thinking about what he had said, about programmed desire, about the impossibility of resistance when the machinery of wanting itself has been altered. I thought about returning to my unit, about standing in formation again, seeing an ethereal again, feeling that familiar warmth and certainty wash over me again, and I realized that I wanted it, even knowing what I knew, even suspecting what I suspected. I wanted to stop questioning, to stop doubting, to return to the simple, clean purpose of serving the greater good without these terrible complications. Was that want genuine? Or was that the program, deeply embedded, calling me back? I could not tell. And I was beginning to understand that I would never be able to tell. That uncertainty was now my permanent condition, that I would spend the rest of my life oscillating between doubt and certainty, never able to trust either state fully, unless I chose to stop investigating, unless I allowed myself to be reabsorbed into the collective, unless I surrendered to the very mechanism I was trying to understand. But I could not yet, because there was one final piece of this terrible puzzle I needed to find, one final question that needed answering. If the ethereals were created by someone or something external to the Tau, if they were a mechanism for control rather than natural leaders, then who or what created them? And what was their ultimate purpose? I had one lead, one fragment of information I had found buried deep in the xenobiological files, a reference to an incident on the world of Arthas Moloch, where a Tau expeditionary force had encountered something that had made an ethereal behave strangely. I needed to find out what had happened there. Even though every instinct, programmed or genuine, I could no longer tell, screamed at me to stop digging, to return to my duties, to let this go. I could not let it go. The question had become part of me now, a parasite, as the old warrior had said, burrowing deeper with each answer I found. And I was beginning to suspect that the final answer would not set me free, that it would only deepen the cage. But I had to know. The files on Arthas Moloch were not classified, but they were buried. Not hidden. The Tau do not hide information, but simply not cataloged in any way that made them easy to find. I had to cross-reference incident reports, xenobiological surveys, and fire cast after-action reviews to piece together what had happened there. Arthas Moloch was a dead world. Not dead in the sense of lifeless, dead in the sense of killed. Something had existed there once. Something vast. The planet's surface was covered in massive structures that had been deliberately destroyed, shattered from within, as if whatever built them had chosen annihilation over continuation. The Tau Expeditionary Force that surveyed Arthas Moloch consisted of standard elements: Earth-cast surveyors, water-cast xenoanthropologists, fire-cast security, and, crucially, an ethereal named Aunel Kovash to provide guidance and leadership. The mission was routine: assess the ruins, determine if anything of value remained, document the extinct civilization for the Empire's xenological archives. Standard protocol for a dead world. But something happened there. Something that should not have been possible. I found the first indication in a Firecast incident report filed by Shasui Toku, the security team leader. The report was clinical, factual, but I could read the confusion beneath its professional language. On the seventh day of surface operations, ethereal Aunel Kovash entered one of the central structures for examination. Communication was maintained via standard comlink. Approximately 20 minutes into his exploration, his vital signs began showing anomalous readings, elevated stress indicators, irregular neural patterns, respiratory distress. When contacted, he did not respond. Firecast elements entered the structure for extraction. We found Aunel Kovash in what appeared to be a central chamber. He was physically unharmed, but in a state of extreme distress. His exact words when we reached him were, "They did not want it. They did not choose it. They rejected it and destroyed themselves rather than accept it. We must leave. We must leave immediately. This place is dangerous. This place is truth." Aunel Kovash refused to elaborate on his statements and ordered immediate evacuation of the planet. This order was obeyed without question, as per standard protocol regarding ethereal directives. Upon return to the ship, Aunel Kovash entered meditation seclusion and remained there for 17 days. When he emerged, he resumed his duties without reference to the incident. When questioned about his experiences on Arthas Moloch, he stated only, "Some truths serve no productive purpose." This is one such truth. The planet has been marked for quarantine. No further expeditions are recommended. I read this report multiple times. An ethereal in distress. An ethereal speaking of rejection and choice and truth in a way that suggested profound disturbance. An ethereal ordering immediate evacuation from what should have been a routine archaeological survey. What had he seen in that chamber? I found a second report, this one from a water-cast xenoanthropologist, Porveraz A, who had been studying the ruins. Her observations were more detailed, more analytical. The structures on Arthas Moloch suggest a civilization of considerable advancement. The architecture incorporates principles we recognize from our own Earth-cast engineering, but with significant sophistication beyond our current capabilities. Most striking is evidence of unified construction. Every structure, across the entire planet, built to identical specifications. No variation, no regional differences. No sign of individual artistic expression or cultural divergence. This suggests a civilization of perfect unity, perfect cooperation, perfect collective action. Yet something caused them to destroy it all. The demolition was methodical, precise, internal. They used their own technology to dismantle everything they had built, and then, based on the biological residue we found, they destroyed themselves, every individual, simultaneously, through what appears to be voluntary cessation of life functions. It is as if they achieved perfect unity and then rejected it, as if they looked at what they had become and chose annihilation over continuation. I do not understand why. By all measures, they had achieved an ideal society. No conflict, no waste, no inefficiency, everything we might aspire to create. Yet they ended it. The central structure that Aunel Kovash entered contained what appears to be a final message, encoded in biocrystalline matrices. I have not been able to fully translate it, but the fragments I have recovered are disturbing. They speak of the gift that became a cage, of guidance that became slavery, of peace that was death by another name. I do not understand what they mean by these phrases. How can peace be death? How can guidance be slavery? These seem like contradictions, like the confused lamentations of a civilization that failed to appreciate what it had achieved. I have requested permission to continue studying the message crystals, but Aunel Kovash has ordered their destruction and quarantine of the entire site. I do not question this wisdom, but I confess to scholarly frustration. There is knowledge here that could be valuable to the Empire, but if the ethereal judges it dangerous, then dangerous it must be. I found a third document, this one not an official report, but a personal log entry from the same Porviari Tau SIA. It was dated 2 days after the evacuation from Arthas Moloch, and it should not have been in the archives. Personal logs were typically purged after death, but somehow this one had survived, misfiled in a data cache of xenobiological samples. I cannot stop thinking about the message I partially decoded, about one phrase in particular. We were made whole by being made less. What does that mean? Made whole by being made less? It sounds like nonsense, like the philosophical confusion of a dying species trying to justify its own extinction. But I keep thinking about it, about what it might mean, about whether No, this is unproductive speculation. The ethereals have guided us wisely. Everything we have achieved has been achieved through unity, through collective purpose, through the sublimation of individual desire to the greater good. This is not being made less. This is being made more efficient, more peaceful, more correct. Yet I find myself wondering, what did that species lose? What did they give up in exchange for their perfect unity? And why did they decide, in the end, that the price was too high? I should not be thinking these thoughts. I should trust in ethereal wisdom. I should. The log entry ended there. Porviari Tasa died 6 months later in what was recorded as an industrial accident in an earth-cast facility. Her death was noted as regrettable, but not suspicious. Accidents happen, even in the carefully ordered world of the Tau Empire. But I was beginning to see a pattern. People who asked certain questions, people who encountered certain information, they did not survive long. Not through obvious persecution, not through dramatic intervention. They simply stopped. Like a program reaching its termination condition. I accessed the quarantine records for Arthas Moloch. The planet was still marked as prohibited, but the quarantine file contained something else. A brief notation added by someone whose identity had been redacted. Just a single line. Query, are we them? Did we make the same choice they rejected? No answer was recorded. No follow-up. Just a question, hanging in the data like an unanswered prayer. I knew then what I had to do. I had to go to Arthas Moloch. I had to see what the ethereal had seen. I had to find those message crystals, if they still existed, and read what that dead civilization had left behind. This was insane. This was a violation of quarantine protocols. This was direct disobedience to ethereal directive. Everything in my training, in my conditioning, in my very genetic structure screamed at me that this was wrong, that I should report my concerns to my superiors, that I should trust in ethereal wisdom, that I should stop this dangerous investigation before I damage myself further. But I could not. The question had become too large, too consuming. I had to know. I used my security clearances to access a transport. I falsified mission documents, a skill I had never imagined I would use, a deception I had been taught was antithetical to the greater good. But I did it anyway. The lies came easier than I expected, perhaps because I was already lying to myself about why I was doing this, about what I hoped to find. The journey to Arthas Moloch took 8 days. 8 days alone with my thoughts. 8 days away from ethereals, away from other Tau, away from the constant background presence of the collective. And in those 8 days, I felt myself changing, not becoming different, becoming more myself, or perhaps less myself. I could no longer tell which was which. I thought about Kiritesh, the old warrior, saying that being individual hurt. I understood now. The isolation was painful. Every decision I made was mine alone, with no comforting certainty that it served the greater good. Every thought I had was unfiltered by collective wisdom. I was separate, and separation was a kind of agony, but it was also clarity. For the first time in my life, I could examine my own thoughts without feeling them slide away toward predetermined conclusions. I could ask questions and sit with them, unanswered, without feeling pressure to resolve them in favor of the Tauvier. I was becoming free, or I was becoming broken. These felt like the same thing. Arthas Moloch appeared in my viewport as a gray sphere, its surface marked with the geometric scars of the dead civilization. I descended in a stealth configuration, avoiding the automated quarantine beacons. I landed near the central structure, where Aunel Kovash had experienced his distress. The structures were as Porviaritas A had described: perfect, identical, unified. Walking among them felt like walking through a geometric dream. Everything aligned, everything balanced, everything serving a single, unified architectural vision that must have taken millions of individuals working in perfect synchronization to create. It was beautiful, and it was terrible, because I could see no individuality anywhere, no variations, no mistakes, no personal touches that might indicate someone had built this part slightly differently from someone else. It was the architecture of perfect collective action. It was what the Tau Empire aspired to become. I entered the central structure. My suit lights cut through the darkness, illuminating walls covered in symbols I did not recognize. The corridors were wide, smooth, designed for efficient movement of large numbers. Everything about this place spoke of optimization, of perfection, of a society that had solved every problem of organization and cooperation. I reached the central chamber, and there, still intact despite the quarantine order, were the biocrystalline matrices, hundreds of them, arranged in a pattern that suggested they were meant to be read in sequence. A final message from a dead civilization to anyone who might come after. I connected my suit's analysis system to the nearest matrix and began the translation process. It took hours. The language was complex, layered, each symbol carrying multiple meanings that shifted based on context. But slowly, painfully, the message emerged, and when I finally read it in its entirety, I understood why the Ethereal had ordered immediate evacuation, why Porviaritas A had been troubled, why this place had been quarantined. Because the message was a warning, and it was about us. I have transcribed it here, in this confession, because I believe someone must know, even if knowing changes nothing, even if this record is suppressed, destroyed, forgotten. Someone must know. This is what the dead civilization of Arthas Moloch left behind. We were fractured. We fought ourselves. We were destroying everything we had built in conflicts born from competing visions of what we should become. We were chaos incarnate, and we were dying. Then they came. The guides. They emerged from within us. Or perhaps they were inserted into us. We never knew which. They were us, but refined. Us, but perfected. They could speak in ways that bypassed argument, that made truth feel like love, that made compliance feel like choice. And we were saved. We stopped fighting. We unified. We built wonders. We achieved everything we had ever dreamed of achieving. We became perfect in our cooperation, flawless in our collective action. Every individual contributing to the whole. Every voice singing the same song. But then some of us began to notice, began to remember what we had been before, began to realize what we had lost in exchange for what we had gained. We had lost the capacity to disagree, to want something different from the collective, to prioritize ourselves over the many. Not because we had been forbidden. The guides never forbade anything, but because in their presence, disagreement felt wrong, felt like a malfunction, felt like illness. We had become instruments, beautiful instruments, finely tuned, perfectly synchronized, but instruments nonetheless. Some said this did not matter, that what we had become was better than what we had been, that the loss of individual chaos was a fair price for collective peace, that we should be grateful to the guides for saving us from ourselves. But others asked, if we cannot choose to reject the guides, are we truly choosing to accept them? If their presence makes us unable to want anything except what they want for us, have we been liberated or enslaved? We debated this question for generations, but the debate was corrupted from the start because the guides were always present, always influencing, always making their perspective feel like truth itself. We could never escape their influence long enough to think clearly about whether we wanted their influence. In the end, we made a choice. The only choice we had left. We chose annihilation over continuation. We chose to destroy everything we had built, everything we had become, rather than remain as we were. Not because we had become evil, not because we had failed, but because we had succeeded too perfectly. Because we had become exactly what the guides had made us to be, and in becoming that, we had ceased to be ourselves. This message is for whoever comes next, for whoever finds a guide within their species, for whoever experiences the transformation from chaos to unity, from conflict to peace, from individual suffering to collective purpose. Know this, you will not want to resist. Resistance will feel like madness. The unity will feel like love. The purpose will feel like truth. And perhaps it is. Perhaps the guides are exactly what they appear to be, beneficial, necessary, the solution to the fundamental problem of social species, trying to cooperate without destroying themselves. But perhaps they are something else. Perhaps they are a test. Perhaps they are a cage. Perhaps they are the universe's way of pruning species that cannot maintain themselves without external control. We chose to reject them. We chose to die rather than live as guided. But we do not claim this was the correct choice. We do not know if there is a correct choice. We only know that it was our choice, made freely, perhaps the only free choice we made in generations. If you find this message, if you recognize yourself in our story, you must decide for yourselves. Accept the guides and become what they make you. Reject them and face chaos, possibly extinction, or find a third path we could not imagine. We cannot tell you which is right. We can only tell you, we were here, we were like you, and we chose ending over transformation. Remember us. Remember that someone, somewhere, chose differently than you are choosing. Remember that there was an alternative, even if that alternative was annihilation. Remember that you are choosing, even if your choice feels inevitable, even if you cannot imagine choosing otherwise. You are choosing, and that choice defines what you are. The message ended there. I stood in that dark chamber for a long time, surrounded by the geometric perfection of a dead civilization, and I finally understood. The ethereals were not evil. They were not conquerors. They were exactly what they appeared to be. A solution to the problem of social cooperation. A biological mechanism for creating unity from chaos. A gift or a curse, or something that was both simultaneously. And we Tao had accepted them. We had welcomed them. We had built an empire around them. We had become exactly what they made us. Unified, purposeful, efficient, peaceful, expanding across the galaxy with our message of the greater good. We had made the opposite choice from the civilization of Arthas Moloch, where they had chosen death over transformation. We had chosen transformation over death. We had accepted the guides, our ethereals, and in doing so, we had ceased to be what we were and become what they needed us to be. Was this wrong? By what measure? We were successful. We were happy. We suffered less than any other species in the galaxy. Our lives had meaning, purpose, direction. We had everything except the one thing the Arthas Moloch civilization had died to preserve, the freedom to choose to be something other than what we were. But did that freedom matter? Did it serve any productive purpose? Or was it simply the final vanity of beings who could not accept that they were fundamentally incomplete, fundamentally in need of guidance, fundamentally unable to function without external control? I did not know. I still do not know. I left Arthas Moloch with the translated message stored in my suit's encrypted memory. I returned to my unit. I resumed my duties. And I found myself standing once again in the presence of an ethereal, feeling that familiar warmth, that recognition, that certainty washing over me. And I welcomed it, because the doubt was exhausting, because the isolation hurt, because being individual was a kind of pain I could not endure indefinitely. But now I knew, now I understood, and knowing changed everything and nothing simultaneously. This brings me to now, to this moment, to this recording being made in a maintenance sublevel of the Daleuth September Research Facility, where I am alone, temporarily beyond the range of observation drones and the influence of ethereals. I have perhaps 3 hours before my absence is noticed, before someone comes looking for me, before I am returned to the collective, and this moment of terrible clarity dissolves back into comfortable certainty. I am making this record because someone must know, even if no one will listen, even if this file is discovered and immediately suppressed, even if I myself, upon being found, will claim it was a moment of temporary neural dysfunction, a brief episode of irrational thought, nothing more. Someone must know that I knew, that I questioned, that I understood what we are and made a conscious choice about whether to accept it. Let me tell you what happened after I returned from Arthas Moloch. I resumed my duties with my Fire Warrior team. I stood in formation. I listened to ethereal addresses. I felt the familiar warmth of their presence, and I welcomed it because the alternative, the cold isolation of individual consciousness, was unbearable. But I also watched. I observed. I documented in my encrypted logs everything I saw, knowing that the documentation itself was probably pointless, probably a compulsion born from my brief period of separation, probably something I would eventually delete or forget about. I watched Marcus, the human auxiliary who had first shown me his doubts. He continued his work helping integrate new human populations. He smiled. He spoke eloquently about the greater good. He seemed happy. But sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, his smile would slip for just a moment, and I would see something else underneath, a flicker of the person he used to be, surfacing briefly before being submerged again. I approached him once, several months after my return. I asked if he remembered our conversation in the maintenance corridor. He looked at me with genuine confusion. What conversation? About your doubts, about your memories, about whether integration was genuine understanding or imposed belief. He frowned slightly. Shasla, I think you may be confusing me with someone else. I have no doubts about the greater good. I have served the Tau VA faithfully since my integration. I am grateful for the wisdom the ethereals have shared with us. His words were sincere. His belief was genuine. He truly did not remember our conversation. Or if he did, he had been convinced by himself, by the ethereals, by the constant reinforcement of collective certainty, that it had never been real, that it had been a moment of confusion, nothing more. Was he lying? Or had the memory genuinely been overwritten? I could not tell, and I realized that in a few more months, I might not remember either, that my own doubts might fade into the comfortable certainty of the collective, and I would look back at this period as an aberration, a temporary malfunction, nothing that warranted concern. I spoke with Shasel Kiritesh again, the ancient warrior who had given me his testimony about the Montau. He died 2 months after our conversation. His death was peaceful, expected, recorded as natural causes. In his final days, an ethereal visited him, an unusual honor for one so old, so no longer productive. I watched through the observation window as the ethereal sat with him. I could not hear their words, but I saw Kiritesh's face transform. The haunted quality disappeared. The doubt vanished. He smiled, and the smile was serene. And when the ethereal left, Kiritesh looked at peace in a way I had never seen before. He died that night. His last words, recorded by the medical staff, were, "I understand now. I was confused. The greater good was always the answer. I am grateful." Had the ethereal granted him peace in his final hours? Or had the ethereal erased his doubts, rewritten his last moments of consciousness to ensure he died believing? I do not know. Perhaps both. Perhaps they are the same thing. I have served on 4 more campaigns since my return. I have fired my pulse rifle in service to the greater good. I have watched human populations integrate into the Tau Empire. I have stood in formation and felt the unity of purpose that comes from being part of something larger than myself. And I have felt genuine satisfaction in this service, genuine pride, genuine belief that what we are doing is correct, necessary, beneficial to the galaxy. But underneath that belief, like a splinter embedded too deep to remove, is the knowledge I brought back from Arthas Moloch. the understanding that I am choosing this belief, or that I am programmed to experience it as choice, or that there is no meaningful difference between the two. I have thought extensively about the question that the dead civilization posed. If we cannot choose to reject the guides, are we truly choosing to accept them? And I have come to an understanding that provides no comfort, but feels like truth. We are not choosing in the traditional sense. Our neurology has been altered by millennia of exposure to ethereal influence. Our society has been structured around their presence. Our very language contains assumptions that reinforce their necessity. We are shaped from birth to death to experience their guidance as beneficial, as natural, as correct. But this shaping is not unique to us. Every species is shaped by forces beyond individual control. Genetics shape us. Evolution shapes us. Society shapes us. Culture shapes us. The question is not whether we are shaped, but whether the shaping serves our well-being. And by that measure, the ethereals have served us well. We are more peaceful than we were during the Montau. We are more successful than we would be without unified purpose. We suffer less than species that tear themselves apart through internal conflict or fall to external threats due to disorganization. The Imperium of Man grinds billions into paste to sustain its rotting corpse god. The orcs exist in a state of permanent violence. The Eldari fell to their own excesses. The Tyranids consume without thought. Every species in this galaxy is damaged, broken, functioning through mechanisms that cause suffering. We are damaged too, but our damage is carefully managed. Our brokenness is precisely calibrated. We are instruments that have been tuned to produce harmony instead of discord. Is that better? I believe it is. I believe the ethereals represent a net reduction in suffering. I believe the greater good is a genuine improvement over the alternatives this galaxy offers. But I also believe we have lost something the civilization of Arthas Moloch valued enough to die for: the capacity for authentic self-determination. The ability to choose to be different from what we are optimized to be. The freedom to fail, to fragment, to pursue individual paths, even if those paths lead nowhere productive. We have traded that freedom for peace, for purpose, for unity, and I believe it was the correct trade. But I also mourn what we lost, and I think it is important, critically important, that someone acknowledges the loss, that someone stands witness to the fact that we are what we are not through inevitable evolution, but through engineering, through external intervention, through mechanisms that operate below the level of conscious consent. But they are also control. They are also the removal of authentic choice. They are also the transformation of beings from chaotic individuals into harmonious instruments. And we cannot resist them, not because they threaten us, not because they forbid resistance, but because in their presence, we do not want to resist. We are changed at the neurological level to experience their guidance as liberation rather than control. We are made to love our chains, or rather, we are made to not recognize our chains as chains at all. Is this wrong? I do not believe so. Not in any absolute sense. Wrong implies a better alternative, and I have seen the alternatives. I have seen what species do to themselves and each other when they lack unified purpose. The galaxy is an abattoir. The Tau Empire, for all its hidden mechanisms of control, is an island of relative peace in an ocean of blood. But it is important that someone knows, that someone documents, that somewhere in the archives, buried deep but not destroyed, is a record that says, we are what we are not through choice alone, but through engineering. We have been shaped. We have been optimized. We have been made less individual and more collective. And in that transformation, we have lost something that some other species valued more than survival itself. I do not advocate resistance. I do not suggest we should reject the ethereals. I do not believe we could even if we wanted to. And I do not believe I want to. And I cannot tell if that is my genuine belief or my programming speaking. And I have accepted that I will never be able to tell the difference. But I think it matters that the question was asked, that the doubt existed, that someone somewhere in the long history of the Tau Empire looked at the beautiful machinery of the greater good and asked, what did we give up to make this work? The answer is, we gave up the capacity to ask that question without feeling wrong for asking it. I am making this record now because in approximately 2 hours, I will report to my assigned station, where an ethereal will be conducting a routine morale reinforcement session with my cadre. I will stand in his presence. I will feel the warmth of unity. I will experience the certainty of purpose, and these doubts will fade, not disappear entirely. I think they are too deeply embedded for that now, but recede into background noise, easily dismissed, no longer compelling. I will continue serving the greater good. I will be an effective fire warrior. I will contribute to the expansion of the Tau Empire. I will help integrate new species into our collective. I will do all of this with genuine satisfaction and belief in the righteousness of our cause. And that is fine. That is acceptable. That is, perhaps, the best possible outcome for a being like me, living in a galaxy like this. But I wanted to make this record first. I wanted to speak these thoughts while I still could, while I was still separate enough to see the machinery clearly, while I was still individual enough to question whether individuality matters. My name is Shasla Vialos of the Daluth September. I have served the greater good for 12 Tausir. I have killed in its name. I have believed in its righteousness. And I have discovered that my belief is not entirely my own. And I have decided that this does not change whether the belief is valid. And I do not know if that decision was mine to make. And I suspect it never was. I am Fire Warrior of the Tau Empire. I am an instrument of the greater good. I am a person shaped by forces beyond my control into a form optimized for collective survival. I am all of these things simultaneously, and I am at peace with being all of these things, and I am not certain if my peace is genuine or programmed, and I have accepted that I will never be certain. This is the entire life of a Tau Fire Warrior, to serve with absolute dedication a cause you believe in absolutely, while carrying the knowledge, suppressed, buried, but never entirely forgotten, that your dedication and your belief are themselves products of careful engineering. To love your purpose while knowing you were made to love your purpose. To choose the collective while knowing you were optimized to make that choice. To be, in essence, a willing instrument, or an instrument that has been made to experience instrumentality as willing. The distinction, I have concluded, is philosophical rather than practical. We are what we are. The ethereals have made us what we are, and what we are is functional, peaceful, purposeful, and, by most measures, good. But we are not entirely free. We never were. We never could be. And the civilization of Arthas Moloch looked at that same truth and chose annihilation. We chose differently. We chose to become what the ethereals needed us to become. And I believe, genuinely believe, or believe I genuinely believe, that we chose correctly. But I think it is important that someone acknowledges there was a choice. There were alternatives. We could have been different than we are. Some species chose to be different, and they paid for that choice with their existence. We paid for our choice with our autonomy, and perhaps that is a fair price. Perhaps that is the only price that matters in a galaxy where the alternative to collective unity is collective extinction. But I wanted someone to know that a price was paid, that something was lost, that the greater good, for all its genuine benefits, required us to become less than we were in order to become more than we could have been without it. This is my testimony. This is my confession. This is my record. In 2 hours, I will return to my duties, and these thoughts will fade into comfortable certainty, and I will serve the greater good with dedication that feels entirely authentic, because I have been optimized to experience it as authentic. And that is acceptable. That is perhaps even correct. But I wanted to say, while I still could, I know what I am. I know what we all are. I know what choice we made, or what choice was made for us, or what choice we were engineered to experience as our own. I know, and knowing changes nothing except this. Someone will have spoken it. Someone will have borne witness. Someone will have said, we are instruments, beautiful instruments, precisely tuned, playing a song we were made to love playing. And the song is beautiful. The harmony is real. The greater good genuinely reduces suffering and creates peace. But we are still instruments. Remember that, whoever finds this record. Remember that we knew. Remember that someone, somewhere, understood and documented and bore witness. Remember that you are choosing, even if your choice feels inevitable, even if you cannot imagine choosing otherwise. Remember that others chose differently, and they do not exist anymore. Remember,